In the merciless heart of the wilderness, where sand meets sky in an endless dance of desolation, the earth itself would soon become witness to a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of divine order. But before the ground split wide to swallow pride whole, before fire fell from heaven like the wrath of angels, there was a man whose name would echo through eternity not as a hero, but as a warning carved in stone and blood. His name was Korah. Picture him now, standing at the edge of the encampment as the sun bleeds crimson across the desert horizon. His robes flutter in the evening wind, bearing the sacred symbols of his tribe, the tribe of Levi, chosen servants of the Most High. His hands, calloused from years of carrying the holy things, clench and unclench as his eyes scan the orderly rows of tents stretching endlessly across the wasteland. Somewhere in that maze of canvas and rope lives his cousin Moses, the man who speaks with God face to face. Somewhere else, his cousin Aaron burns incense that rises like prayers to heaven itself. And here stands Korah, forever in their shadows, forever carrying their glory on his back, while his own voice remains unheard. The blood that flows through his veins is ancient, older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than the chains that once bound his people. It is the blood of Levi, the fierce son of Jacob, the man who drew his sword in righteous fury when honor was defiled. It is sacred blood, priestly blood, blood that has touched the holy things of God and lived to tell the tale. Yet as Korah stands there in the dying light, watching the smoke of sacrifice rise from Aaron's tent, that sacred blood burns with something far more dangerous than righteousness. It burns with ambition. The camp around him hums with the evening rituals of 600,000 souls. Children laugh as they chase each other between the guy ropes. Women draw water from wells that spring miraculously from stone. Men tend to flocks that somehow find sustenance in this barren land. And through it all, the presence of the Almighty hovers over them in a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, a constant reminder that they are not abandoned, not forgotten, not alone. But Korah feels alone, desperately, achingly alone. He remembers Egypt, though he wishes he could forget. He remembers the weight of Hebrew sweat and Hebrew tears, the crack of Egyptian whips and the groan of Hebrew backs bent beneath impossible burdens. He remembers when Moses was just a name whispered in the slave quarters, a boy who had been lifted from the Nile and clothed in Egyptian gold while the rest of them toiled in Egyptian mud. Even then, even as a child hauling bricks beneath the pitiless sun, Korah had wondered why some were chosen for palaces while others were chosen for pain. The years had taught him to swallow such questions, to bury them beneath duty and discipline. He had learned to carry the tabernacle's sacred poles without complaint, to tend the holy vessels without question, to stand at the edges of divine glory while others stepped into its center. He had convinced himself that service was enough, that proximity to the sacred was its own reward. But proximity is not possession. Service is not sovereignty. And a man can swallow his questions for only so long before they begin to claw their way back up his throat. The rebellion did not begin with Korah. It began with Moses himself, 40 years earlier, when a prince of Egypt looked upon Hebrew suffering and made a choice that changed the course of history. It began when Moses lifted his hand against an Egyptian taskmaster and watched the man fall dead in the sand. It began when Moses fled into the wilderness, leaving his people to wonder if there would be deliverer, was hero or coward, prophet or pretender. For 40 years, Moses vanished. 40 years of silence, 40 years of wondering, 40 years of hope deferred, until hope became a bitter taste in Hebrew mouths. Some said he was dead. Others claimed he had forgotten them, become comfortable in his exile, married his Midianite wife, and settled into a life of peaceful obscurity while his brothers suffered under Pharaoh's lash. Only Korah seemed to understand the truth. Moses had not abandoned them. He had been preparing, learning, planning, growing into something more than what he had been. But that understanding brought no comfort, only a deeper, more complex pain. For if Moses could transform himself from stammering prince to prophet of God, if he could disappear into the wilderness and return as the voice of divine authority, then what did that say about the nature of calling itself? What did it say about the mysterious ways that God chose his instruments? And if God could choose Moses, if he could elevate Aaron, if he could reach down from heaven and lift up whomever he pleased, regardless of birth or bloodline or apparent worthiness, then why not Korah? Why not the man who had served faithfully through 4 decades of wandering, who had never questioned an order or shirked a duty, who had carried the holy things with reverence and awe, even when his heart was breaking with loneliness? The questions multiplied like serpents in his mind, each one birthing 3 more, until his thoughts became a writhing mass of doubt and desire, ambition and anguish. He began to watch Moses differently, to study the way the prophet carried himself, the way he spoke with casual authority about the will of God. He began to question whether that authority was real or merely assumed, divine or merely human, eternal or temporary. And late at night, when the camp was still and the only sounds were the whisper of wind through tent flaps and the distant bleating of sheep, Korah would lie on his sleeping mat and dream of fire. Not the fire of judgment, but the fire of acceptance. Not the fire that consumes, but the fire that consecrates. He dreamed of standing where Aaron stood, of lifting his hands as Aaron lifted his, of offering incense that rose like a bridge between earth and heaven. He dreamed of being chosen. The dreams were so vivid, so overwhelming in their intensity, that he would wake with tears on his cheeks and a taste of smoke in his mouth. He would lie there in the darkness, listening to his own heartbeat, wondering if dreams could be prophecies, if desires could be callings, if the voice of ambition could ever be mistaken for the voice of God. In those liminal moments between sleep and waking, between dream and reality, between hope and despair, Korah began to believe that perhaps they could. The transformation began slowly, like water seeping through limestone, invisible at first, but relentless in its persistence. Where once Korah had moved through the camp with quiet dignity, now he moved with purpose. Where once he had kept his thoughts to himself, now he began to share them with others who would listen. And there were many who would listen, for discontent, like disease, spreads most rapidly in close quarters. The wilderness had a way of wearing down men's souls. The endless marching, the constant uncertainty, the promises that seemed always just beyond the next ridge or the next valley, all of it created a fertile ground for questions, for doubts, for the kind of whispered conversations that begin in shadows and end in revolution. Korah found his first allies among his own kinsmen, the other Levites who shared his burdens and his resentments. There was Dathan, whose weathered face bore the scars of Egyptian whips and Hebrew disappointments. There was Abiram, whose eyes held the cold fire of a man who had seen too much injustice and swallowed too much silence. And there was On, son of Peleth, whose very presence reminded everyone that discontent was not limited to a single tribe or family, but could spread like wildfire across all the artificial boundaries that supposedly divided the children of Israel. At first, their gatherings were innocent enough. They would meet in the evening, after the day's work was done, sharing bread and wine and stories of better days. They spoke of Egypt, not with the bitterness that usually colored such memories, but with a strange nostalgia for certainty, for knowing one's place in the world, even if that place was lowly. They remembered the taste of leeks and onions, the sound of the Nile lapping against muddy banks, the solid reality of brick and mortar beneath their hands. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the tenor of their conversations began to change. Egypt became the land flowing with milk and honey, a bitter irony that Moses himself had used to describe their destination. The wilderness became not a necessary passage, but a trap, a prison without walls where they were condemned to wander until death claimed them one by one. And Moses became not their deliverer, but their deceiver, the man who had led them out of certainty into chaos, out of harsh but predictable slavery into an endless exile where death stalked them at every turn. Korah was the articulate one, the man whose words could take the formless frustrations of his listeners and shape them into arguments that sounded almost reasonable, almost righteous. He had a gift for taking a grain of truth and surrounding it with just enough context to make it seem like the whole truth. Yes, Moses had promised them a homeland. Yes, they had been wandering for nearly 4 decades. Yes, people were dying in the wilderness, the old generation. The ones who had known Egypt firsthand were passing away one by one, taking their memories and their wisdom with them into the silence of the grave. But Korah's real genius lay not in what he said about Moses, but in what he said about themselves. He reminded them that they were not common men, not ordinary wanderers in an extraordinary story. They were Levites, chosen by God himself to tend his holy things. They were the descendants of the man who had defended his sister's honor with steel and fire. They were the tribe that had answered Moses' call on the day of the golden calf, the ones who had drawn their swords for righteousness when others had bowed to idolatry. Why then should they be content with servitude? Why should they carry the holy things but never touch them? Why should they labor in the shadows while others stood in the light? Were they not all holy? Were they not all chosen? Was not the presence of God among them a sign that he dwelt not in the tent of meeting alone, but in the hearts of all his people? The questions were seductive in their logic, dangerous in their implications. They suggested that the hierarchies that governed their lives were human constructions rather than divine commands, that the authority of Moses and Aaron was assumed rather than assigned, political rather than prophetic. And once that seed of doubt was planted, it grew with terrifying speed. Others began to come to their gatherings. Not just Levites now, but men from every tribe, leaders and chieftains who had their own reasons for questioning the established order. 250 of them eventually, each one a man of reputation and influence, each one carrying with him a power to sway dozens or hundreds of others. The irony was exquisite and terrible. In seeking to challenge Moses' authority, they were proving its necessity. For without a clear chain of command, without an unquestioned leader, their rebellion became a hydra with too many heads, each one speaking a different language of grievance. Some complained about Moses' leadership in general, his decisions about when to march and when to rest, his choices about which routes to take and which enemies to fight. Others focused specifically on Aaron's priesthood, arguing that the right to offer sacrifice and burn incense should not be limited to a single family, no matter how holy that family might be. Still others seemed motivated by nothing more than personal ambition, the desire to carve out a larger role for themselves in whatever new order might emerge from the chaos they were helping to create. But Korah himself remained focused, laser-sharp in his vision of what needed to change. It was not enough to remove Moses from power. Someone else would simply take his place, and the fundamental problem would remain unsolved. What was needed was a complete restructuring of their society, a recognition that holiness was not the exclusive province of a few chosen families, but the birthright of every child of Israel. All the congregation is holy, he would say, and the words rang with truth. Every one of them, and the Lord is among them. And then, with a slight shift in tone that transformed statement into accusation, why then do you set yourselves above the Lord as assembly? It was a masterstroke of rhetoric, turning Moses' own theology against him. For had not Moses himself proclaimed that Israel was to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation? Had he not declared that God's presence would dwell among them, not above them? Had he not taught them that the Lord their God was not like the distant deities of other nations, but was near to all who called upon him? If all of this was true, and who could deny that it was, then what gave Moses the right to act as an intermediary? What gave Aaron the exclusive privilege of approaching God's throne? What made their voices more worthy to be heard than the voices of any other faithful Israelite? The question spread through the camp like smoke from a wildfire, carried on the evening breeze from tent to tent, from family to family, from tribe to tribe. And with them came something even more dangerous than doubt: hope. The hope that change was possible, that the established order could be overturned, that ordinary men could rise up and claim their rightful place in the divine scheme of things. It was a hope that would prove more destructive than any plague, more deadly than any serpent, more final than any judgment that had yet fallen upon the children of Israel. For it was the hope of rebellion disguised as the hope of redemption, and it would lead them all, the righteous and the wicked, the faithful and the faithless, the guilty and the innocent, to the very brink of destruction. By the time Moses realized what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. The rebellion had moved beyond the stage of whispered conversations and private meetings. It had become a public challenge, a gauntlet thrown down before the entire assembly of Israel, a test of divine authority that would demand a divine response. The confrontation came on a morning when the air itself seemed to thrum with tension, when even the children sensed that something momentous was about to unfold and stayed close to their mother's sides. Korah had spent the night in preparation, not in prayer, though he told himself that his thoughts were a form of prayer, but in rehearsal, practicing the words he would use, the arguments he would make, the righteous indignation he would display when the moment came to speak truth to power. He dressed carefully that morning, choosing robes that emphasized his status as a Levite, while avoiding any ostentation that might be seen as prideful. He wanted to look like a man of the people, a servant of God rather than a seeker of position. He wanted his appearance to reinforce his message, that this was not about personal ambition, but about justice, not about individual advancement, but about collective liberation. The 250 men who had thrown their lot in with him were equally careful in their preparations. They came from every tribe, every level of society, every corner of the vast encampment. Some were old men whose beards had gone white in the wilderness. Others were young firebrands whose passion burned hotter than the desert sun. Some were warriors whose scars told stories of battles fought and won. Others were scholars whose minds had been sharpened on the whetstones of law and tradition. What united them was not their backgrounds, but their grievances, not their histories, but their hopes. Each had his own reason for following Korah, his own vision of what might be possible if the established order could be overthrown. And each had convinced himself that his personal desires aligned perfectly with the will of God. They gathered at the entrance to the tent of meeting, that sacred space where heaven and earth intersected, where the divine presence dwelt among mortal men. It was a calculated choice of venue, designed to maximize the symbolic impact of their challenge. They were not rebels meeting in secret, but concerned citizens bringing their grievances to the very threshold of divine authority. Moses emerged from his tent to find them waiting for him, arranged in a semicircle that managed to look both respectful and threatening. Their faces wore expressions of grave concern, as if they were reluctant participants in this confrontation, men forced by conscience to speak truths that others were too cowardly to voice. Korah stepped forward as their spokesman, his voice carrying clearly across the assembly ground. "You have gone too far," he said, and the words were carefully chosen to sound like a statement of fact rather than an accusation. "For all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you set yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" It was a masterpiece of political theater, combining theological argument with populist appeal, wrapping personal ambition in the language of democratic reform. The assembled crowd murmured their approval, some nodding openly, others whispering their agreement to their neighbors. Here at last was someone willing to say what they had all been thinking, to give voice to the frustrations they had all been feeling. Moses' response was swift and telling. He did not argue, did not defend himself, did not attempt to justify his authority through appeals to past achievements or divine endorsements. Instead, he fell face down on the ground, prostrating himself before God in a gesture that was both submission and supplication, both humility and desperation. In that moment, the true nature of the conflict became clear. This was not a political dispute that could be resolved through negotiation or compromise. This was not a question of administrative efficiency or organizational structure. This was a fundamental challenge to the divine order itself, a test of whether God's choices would be honored or whether they would be subject to popular approval. Moses rose slowly from the ground, dust still clinging to his robes, his face bearing the weight of terrible knowledge. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of one who had stood on burning mountains and heard the voice of thunder, who had seen the back of God's glory and lived to tell the tale. In the morning, he said, the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will cause him to come near to him. Even him whom he chooses, he will cause to come near to him. It was both a prophecy and a challenge, both a promise and a threat. God himself would settle this dispute, not through human argument or political maneuvering, but through divine demonstration. The test would be simple and absolute. Each man would offer incense before the Lord, and he whom God accepted would be shown to be his chosen one. The terms were more dangerous than Korah had anticipated, but he could not back down now without losing face before his followers and the assembled multitude. Too much had been said, too many bridges had been burned, too many expectations had been raised. The momentum of rebellion carried him forward like a river in flood, sweeping away all possibility of retreat or reconciliation. Tomorrow, Moses continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, take censers, Korah and all your company, and put fire in them, and put incense on them before the Lord. And it shall be that the man whom the Lord chooses, he shall be holy. You sons of Levi have gone too far. The irony was crushing. Moses was using Korah's own words against him, turning his accusation back upon itself. If anyone had gone too far, it was not the man who submitted to divine authority, but the men who presumed to challenge it. If anyone was overreaching, it was not the servant who obeyed, but the servants who demanded the right to redefine the terms of their service. But Korah was too committed to his course to recognize the irony, too intoxicated by the prospect of vindication to see the trap that was closing around him. He heard only what he wanted to hear, that God would indeed choose between them, that divine authority would be demonstrated through divine action, that the question of who is truly holy would be settled once and for all. That night, as the camp buzzed with anticipation and anxiety, Korah made his final preparations. He selected his finest censer, polished its bronze surface until it gleamed like gold, filled it with the purest incense he could obtain. He rehearsed the words he would speak when the fire fell, the gracious acceptance speech he would deliver when God's choice was revealed. He never once considered the possibility that God might choose otherwise. The other 250 men made similar preparations, each one convinced that his own righteousness, his own faithfulness, his own intimate knowledge of divine will would tip the scales in his favor. They saw themselves not as rebels, but as reformers, not as usurpers, but as liberators, not as challenges to divine authority, but as instruments of divine justice. None of them slept well that night. How could they, with so much at stake, with the entire future of Israel hanging in the balance? They lay on their mats listening to the desert wind, each man alone with his thoughts, his fears, his desperate hopes that the gamble they were taking would pay off in vindication rather than destruction. Morning came with the inexorable certainty of Judgment Day. Dawn broke over the wilderness with an ominous beauty, painting the eastern sky in shades of scarlet and gold that seemed to prophesy the blood and fire that would soon stain the earth. The camp stirred early, awakened not by the usual sounds of routine, but by the electric tension that filled the air like the charge before a thunderstorm. Everyone knew that this day would be different, that whatever happened at the tent of meeting would change everything. Korah rose before the sun, his hands steady as he made his final preparations. The censer felt heavier than usual in his grip, weighted not just with bronze, but with the accumulated hopes and fears of 250 men, who had placed their trust in his vision. He dressed in his finest robes, the ones reserved for the most sacred occasions, their white linen gleaming against the darkness of his skin. Around him, the other rebels were making similar preparations. Each man had his own censer, his own supply of incense, his own carefully rehearsed understanding of what would happen when the moment of truth arrived. They moved with the deliberate care of soldiers, preparing for battle, checking and rechecking their equipment, adjusting their robes, clearing their throats for the prayers they would soon offer. The atmosphere was strange, almost festive in its intensity. These men were convinced they were about to witness the most important religious ceremony in human history, the moment when God would democratize his presence and open the priesthood to all who were worthy. They saw themselves as pioneers of a new spiritual order, revolutionaries of righteousness, who would be remembered forever as the men who broke the monopoly of Aaron's family and returned holiness to the people. Moses watched them from a distance, his face grave with the knowledge of what was to come. He had spent the night in prayer, not asking God to change his mind. He knew better than that, but asking for the strength to witness what must happen to bear the terrible weight of divine justice without being crushed by it. Aaron stood beside him, pale but resolute, holding his own censer with hands that trembled only slightly. The high priest understood better than anyone what was at stake in this confrontation. It was not just his position that was being challenged, but the entire structure of mediation between heaven and earth, the careful system of ritual and hierarchy that kept the holy fire from consuming the people it was meant to bless. As the sun climbed higher, the crowd began to gather. Word had spread throughout the camp during the night, carried from tent to tent by whispered rumors and excited speculation. By the time the confrontation was ready to begin, virtually every man, woman, and child in Israel had found a place where they could see what was about to unfold. They came not as partisans, but as witnesses, drawn by the same terrible fascination that draws people to watch executions or natural disasters. They sensed that they were about to see something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for generations to come. Some came hoping to see Moses humbled, others praying that his authority would be vindicated. Most came simply because they could not stay away. The tent of meeting stood at the center of it all, its fabric walls glowing softly in the morning light, the pillar of cloud hovering above it like a visible reminder of the invisible presence that dwelt within. This was the place where Moses spoke with God face to face, where the voice of heaven became audible to human ears, where the infinite condescended to communicate with the finite. Korah and his followers took their positions in a wide semicircle around the entrance to the tent, their censers held at the ready, their faces set in expressions of determined righteousness. They looked like priests preparing for a solemn ritual, like servants of God about to perform the most sacred duty imaginable. Moses stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled multitude. "Hear now, you sons of Levi," he said, his words weighted with sorrow rather than anger. "Is it a small thing to you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel, to bring you near to himself, to do the work of the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them?" It was one last attempt at reason, one final offer of perspective before the point of no return. Moses was reminding them of what they already had, of the honor that had already been bestowed upon them, of the proximity to holiness that was already theirs by divine gift rather than human achievement. But his words fell on deaf ears. Korah and his followers had moved beyond the reach of reason, beyond the possibility of compromise. They had staked everything on this moment, invested too much of themselves in this rebellion to back down now. They heard Moses' words not as wisdom, but as condescension, not as truth, but as the desperate attempt of a threatened leader to maintain his grip on power. He has brought you near to himself, Moses continued, you and all your brethren, the sons of Levi, with you. And are you seeking the priesthood also? The question hung in the air like an accusation, cutting through all the theological rhetoric and political maneuvering to the heart of the matter. This was not about justice or democracy or the proper interpretation of divine will. This was about ambition, pure and simple, about men who were not content with the roles they had been given and demanded roles they had not been assigned. Korah's jaw tightened, but he did not answer directly. Instead, he lifted his censer higher, letting the gesture speak for itself. The time for words was over. The time for action had come. Moses sighed deeply, the sound carrying all the weariness of 4 decades spent mediating between heaven and earth, between divine perfection and human frailty. Therefore you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord, he said. For what is Aaron that you complain against him? With those words, he made it clear that this was not a dispute between men, but a rebellion against God himself. Aaron was not their enemy. He was merely the instrument through whom divine will was expressed. To challenge his priesthood was to challenge the one who had appointed him. To question his authority was to question the wisdom of the Almighty. The moment had come. Moses nodded to Aaron, who stepped forward with his own censer, already smoking with holy fire. The high priest's face was set in lines of infinite sadness, like a father forced to discipline a beloved but wayward child. Korah raised his censer, and 250 men followed his example. The morning air filled with the sweet, heavy scent of burning incense, with prayers that rose like smoke toward a heaven that watched in terrible silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The smoke rose, the prayers ascended, the crowd held its breath in collective anticipation. It was possible to believe, in that suspended instant, that God might indeed accept all their offerings, that the divine presence might manifest itself in blessing rather than judgment. Then the ground began to tremble. The trembling began as a whisper in the sand, so subtle that only those standing closest to the tent of meeting felt it at first. It was not the familiar shaking of an earthquake, not the rolling motion that sometimes swept across the desert, when the deep places of the earth stirred in their sleep. This was different, purposeful, directed, as if the very ground beneath their feet was responding to a command that mortal ears could not hear. Korah felt it first, a strange vibration that seemed to rise up through the soles of his feet and travel along his spine like the touch of an invisible hand. He looked down at the earth where he stood, noting how the sand seemed to be shifting almost imperceptibly, forming tiny whirlpools that appeared and disappeared in the space of a heartbeat. The incense continued to rise from his censer, its sweet smoke forming delicate spirals in the still morning air. Around him, the other 250 men held their positions, their faces set in expressions of determined faith, their prayers continuing to ascend toward heaven like an army of intercession. But something was wrong. The silence from above was too complete, too absolute. When Aaron offered incense, there was always a sense of acceptance, a feeling that the prayers were heard and received by the divine presence that dwelt within the tent of meeting. Now there was only emptiness, a void where blessing should have been, an absence that grew more ominous with each passing moment. Moses stepped back from the confrontation, his weathered face pale with terrible knowledge. He had seen this expression on the face of God before, not visible to human eyes, but unmistakable to one who had spent decades learning to read the subtle signs of divine displeasure. The pillar of cloud above the tent was darkening, thickening, taking on a weight and density that spoke of judgment rather than mercy. "Separate yourselves from among this congregation," Moses called out, his voice carrying an urgency that made the assembled multitude take involuntary steps backward, "that I may consume them in a moment." The words were not his own. They came from the voice that spoke from within the tent, the voice that had carved commandments into stone and parted seas with a word. God himself was speaking, and his words carried the promise of immediate and absolute destruction for those who had dared to challenge his chosen order. Moses and Aaron fell face down on the ground, their bodies pressed against the trembling earth in gestures of desperate intercession. "O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh," Moses cried, his voice muffled by the dust, but carrying clearly across the assembly ground. "Shall one man sin, and you be angry with all the congregation?" It was the prayer of a mediator, the cry of one who stood between divine wrath and human frailty. Moses was not defending Korah and his followers. He knew too well the magnitude of their rebellion to attempt such a thing. But he was pleading for the innocent, for the thousands of Israelites who had been drawn into this confrontation by curiosity rather than complicity. The voice from the tent spoke again, its words causing the very air to shimmer with power. "Speak to the congregation, saying, 'Get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram.'" Moses rose quickly, dust still clinging to his robes, and began to run toward the section of the camp where the rebels had pitched their dwellings. Behind him, Aaron remained prostrate before the tent of meeting, his own censer smoking with intercession, his prayers rising like a barrier between the people and the judgment that threatened to consume them all. The crowd began to move, slowly at first, and with growing urgency as they realized that something unprecedented was about to occur. Parents grabbed their children, elders leaned on their staffs for support, young men helped the aged and infirm to move away from the danger zone. The entire camp was in motion, flowing away from the tents of the rebels like water, flowing away from a broken dam. But Korah himself did not move. He stood rooted in place, his censer still smoking in his hands, his eyes fixed on the tent of meeting as if waiting for a sign that his offering had been accepted. Around him, his 250 followers held their positions with similar determination, their faith in their cause stronger than their fear of the consequences. They had gone too far to retreat now. They had staked everything on this moment, burned every bridge that might have led back to safety and reconciliation. To flee now would be to admit that their rebellion had been not only futile but wrong, that their understanding of divine will had been not only mistaken but blasphemous. So they stood their ground and waited for vindication that would never come. Moses reached the area where the rebels' families had gathered, his voice hoarse with shouting as he warned them to flee. "Depart now from the tents of these wicked men," he called, his words cutting through the morning air like a sword. "Touch nothing of theirs, lest you be consumed in all their sins." Most of the families obeyed, grabbing whatever possessions they could carry and running toward the main body of the camp. But some remained, wives who could not abandon their husbands, children who did not understand the magnitude of what was happening, elderly relatives who moved too slowly to escape the approaching judgment. Dathan and Abiram stood at the entrances to their tents, their faces set in expressions of defiant contempt. They had refused Moses' earlier summons to meet with him, and they refused now to acknowledge the danger that surrounded them. In their minds, this was all an elaborate piece of theater, a desperate attempt by Moses to maintain his authority through fear and intimidation. "If these men die naturally like all men," Moses proclaimed, his voice carrying across the assembled multitude with prophetic authority, "or if they are visited by the common fate of all men, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates a new thing and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the pit, then you will understand that these men have rejected the Lord." The words were both prophecy and challenge, both promise and threat. Moses was not calling down judgment. He was simply announcing what God had already determined, giving voice to a divine decision that had been made in the councils of eternity before the first word was spoken. As the last syllable left his lips, the earth convulsed. It was not a gradual collapse or a slow settling of unstable ground. It was an instantaneous transformation, as if the solid earth beneath the rebels' feet had suddenly become liquid, as if the very atoms that held the ground together had been commanded to release their bonds and return to chaos. A chasm opened where Korah stood, its edges perfectly defined, its depths lost in darkness. It seemed to swallow light itself. The sound was indescribable, not the rumble of an earthquake or the crash of falling stone, but something deeper and more fundamental, like the sound of creation running in reverse. Korah had time for one final look around, one last moment of awareness before the ground beneath him gave way completely. His censer fell from nerveless fingers as he reached out desperately for something solid to grab. But there was nothing there, nothing but empty air and the terrible certainty that he had been wrong about everything. The earth swallowed him whole, along with his house, his possessions, and all the men who had stood with him in rebellion. Dathan and Abiram disappeared into the chasm along with their families, their defiant words cut short by the absolute finality of divine judgment. The 250 men who had offered unauthorized incense were consumed by fire that fell from heaven, their bodies reduced to ash in the space between one heartbeat and the next. And then, as suddenly as it had opened, the earth closed again, leaving only smooth sand where the rebels had stood, as if they had never existed at all. The silence that followed was complete and terrible, broken only by the sound of weeping from those who had lost friends and family members in the judgment. The assembled multitude stood frozen in place, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid to do anything that might draw the attention of the God who had just demonstrated his power in such an unmistakable way. But in the depths below, where human ears could not reach, another sound began, faint at first, then growing stronger with each passing moment. It was the sound of a voice crying out in the darkness, a voice that would echo through the ages with words of confession and regret. Moses is true, and his Torah is true, and we are liars. Years passed like sand through an hourglass, each grain marking another day of wandering, another sunset in the wilderness, another step closer to the promised land that seemed always just beyond the horizon. The story of Korah's rebellion became legend, then myth, then parable, a cautionary tale told around campfires and whispered in the tents of the faithful. But the story was not finished. Death, it seemed, was not always the end of a man's influence upon the world. In a section of the camp where the surviving Levites pitched their tents, 3 young men went about their daily duties with unusual quietness, their faces bearing the weight of a legacy they had not chosen but could not escape. They were Asir, Elkanah, and Abiasaph, the sons of Korah, the children of rebellion, the heirs to a name that would forever be associated with divine judgment and human pride. They had not died with their father. At the last moment, when the earth began to tremble and the chasm started to open, they had felt something that their father had lost long ago. The fear of the Lord, it is the beginning of wisdom. While Korah stood firm in his defiance, while he maintained his righteous indignation, even as the ground crumbled beneath his feet, his sons had experienced a moment of clarity that saved their lives. It was not a dramatic conversion, not a sudden reversal of deeply held beliefs. It was simpler and more profound than that. A moment of recognition, a flash of understanding that their father's cause was not God's cause. That rebellion against divine authority could never be disguised as service to divine will, no matter how eloquent the arguments or how righteous the rhetoric. They had stepped back from the brink, literally and figuratively, separating themselves from their fathers as company, just as Moses had commanded the people to separate themselves from the tents of the wicked. It was a choice that saved their lives, but cost them everything else: their family identity, their sense of belonging, their place in the community of Israel. In the aftermath of the judgment, they found themselves in a strange liminal space, neither fully guilty nor entirely innocent, neither condemned nor completely accepted. They bore their father's name and carried his bloodline, but they had not shared his fate. They were living reminders of both rebellion and redemption, of the consequences of pride and the possibility of grace. The other Levites treated them with careful courtesy, speaking to them when necessary, but never inviting them into their inner circles. The rest of the Israelites regarded them with a mixture of pity and suspicion, wondering whether the seeds of rebellion might be dormant in their blood, waiting for the right conditions to sprout and grow. But the sons of Korah themselves were changed in ways that went deeper than social ostracism or communal suspicion. They had looked into the abyss, literally and figuratively, and seen what lay at the bottom. They had witnessed the ultimate consequence of challenging divine authority, the final destination of all human pride and ambition when it set itself against the will of heaven. The experience marked them, shaped them, transformed them into something different from what they had been before. They became men of profound humility, servants who understood service not as diminishment but as privilege, worshippers who approached the sacred with reverence rather than presumption. And somewhere in the depths of their transformed hearts, music began to grow. It started as a whisper, a melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They would find themselves humming it while they worked, hearing it in the sound of wind through tent ropes and the rhythm of their own heartbeats. It was not a song of celebration or triumph, not a hymn of easy joy or simple faith. It was something deeper and more complex, a song born from the marriage of sorrow and grace, of judgment and mercy, of human failure and divine love. The words came later, flowing from their lips like water from a spring they had not known existed within them. They sang of thirsting for God like deer, panting for streams of water, of longing for the courts of the Lord with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. They sang of the beauty of divine dwelling places, of the blessedness of those who found their strength in the Almighty rather than in themselves. Better is one day in your courts, they sang, than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. The irony was not lost on them. They had been born into a family that demanded to enter the Holy of Holies, that insisted on the right to stand where only the high priest was allowed to go. Now they sang of the joy of being doorkeepers, of finding fulfillment in the humblest service rather than the highest office. Their songs spread through the camp like ripples on still water, carried from tent to tent by voices that found in them something their own hearts had been trying to say but could not articulate. These were not the martial hymns of victory or the liturgical chants of ritual observance. These were songs of the soul, expressions of the deepest human longing for connection with the divine. The melodies were haunting, unforgettable, seeming to capture something essential about the human condition. The tension between aspiration and limitation, the longing for transcendence and the acceptance of finitude, the desire for significance and the recognition of dependence. As the years passed and the sons of Korah grew into middle age, their reputation as songwriters and worship leaders began to eclipse their identity as children of rebellion. People stopped seeing them primarily as Korah's sons and started seeing them as gifted servants of God in their own right men, whose unique experience of judgment and grace had given them insights into the nature of worship that others could not achieve. When David became king and established his capital in Jerusalem, he called for the most skilled musicians in Israel to lead worship in the temple he planned to build. The sons of Korah, now grown men with children and grandchildren of their own, were among those chosen, not despite their lineage, but because of what that lineage had taught them about the proper relationship between humanity and divinity. They became the temple's premier songwriters, composing psalms that would be sung for generations to come, words that would comfort the afflicted and challenge the comfortable melodies that would carry the prayers of countless worshipers to the throne of heaven. Their songs spoke of God as refuge and strength, as a very present help in trouble, as the one who dwells in the midst of his people, not as tyrant but as protector. They sang of streams that make glad the city of God, of mountains that could be cast into the sea without causing fear in those who trusted in the Lord. But perhaps their most profound contribution was their understanding of worship itself, not as performance or obligation, but as response to grace, not as human achievement, but as divine gift, not as the right of the righteous, but as the privilege of the redeemed. They had learned these truths in the hardest school imaginable, through the failure of their father and the mercy of their God. They had seen what happened when worship became self-assertion rather than self-surrender, when service became a platform for pride rather than an expression of humility. And they had been transformed by that knowledge into something their father could never have imagined. Not priests who demanded the right to offer sacrifice, but psalmists who offered something far more precious, songs that would carry the prayers of generations to the throne of grace, melodies that would remind all who heard them that the proper response to divine love is not presumption but praise. In the end, all earthly voices fall silent. Kings die, prophets pass away. Even the most eloquent speakers eventually find their words reduced to dust and their arguments forgotten by history. But some voices, it seems, are destined to echo through eternity, not in triumph, but in testimony to truths that transcend the grave. Deep beneath the earth, in places where mortal feet have never walked and sunlight has never shone, there is a voice that still speaks. It does not plead or argue or justify. It does not seek vindication or demand reconsideration. It simply states a truth that took an eternity of suffering to learn, a confession that rings through the darkness with the clarity of absolute understanding. Moses is true, and his Torah is true, and we are liars. The rabbis say that this voice can be heard by those who know how to listen, by those who approach the places where judgment fell with ears opened by wisdom and hearts prepared by humility. They tell of travelers who have heard it echoing from deep caves of scholars, who have perceived it whispered in the silence between words of Torah study of saints, who have recognized it in their own moments of deepest repentance. It is not a voice of despair, though it speaks from the depths of divine punishment. It is not a voice of rebellion, though it belongs to one who once led the greatest rebellion in human history. It is, instead, a voice of truth finally acknowledged, of pride finally broken, of understanding finally achieved at the cost of everything that once seemed important. The tradition teaches that even in the place of punishment, even in the depths of divine judgment, the possibility of transformation remains. Korah's voice crying from the underworld is not evidence of his final condemnation, but proof of his ultimate redemption, not from punishment, for that must run its course, but from the blindness and arrogance that made punishment necessary. His sons had learned this lesson in time to save their lives and transform their legacy. Korah himself learned it too late to change his fate, but not too late to change his understanding. In the darkness below, stripped of all pretense and all pride, he finally saw clearly what he had refused to see in the light above. Moses had been true, not because he was perfect, for no human being is perfect, but because he had been faithful to the calling God had placed upon him. He had not sought power for its own sake, but had accepted responsibility when it was thrust upon him. He had not claimed divine authority for himself, but had served as a conduit for divine will, always pointing beyond himself to the source of all true authority. The Torah had been true, not as human wisdom masquerading as divine revelation, but as the authentic word of God, spoken through human lips and written by human hands. It had not been Moses' attempt to control the people through religious manipulation, but God's attempt to teach the people how to live in relationship with their Creator and with one another. And Korah and his followers had been liars, not because they had intentionally deceived themselves and others, but because they had mistaken their own desires for divine will, their own ambitions for righteous causes, their own understanding for ultimate truth. They had convinced themselves that their rebellion was actually faithfulness, that their challenge to divine authority was actually service to divine justice. The tragedy was not that they had wanted to serve God. That desire was noble and right. The tragedy was that they had wanted to serve God on their own terms rather than His, to redefine holiness according to their own understanding rather than accept it as a gift to be received with gratitude and humility. From his place in the depths, Korah could see clearly now what he had been blind to before. He could see that holiness was not a right to be claimed, but a responsibility to be accepted, not a privilege to be demanded, but a burden to be carried with faithfulness and fear. He could see that true authority came not from position or power, but from submission to the One whose authority was absolute and whose love was unfailing. And he could see that his punishment, terrible as it was also a kind of mercy, not because it was pleasant or easy, but because it was educative, not because it felt good, but because it taught truth that could not be learned any other way. The voice from the depths became in time a strange kind of ministry, not the ministry Korah had sought in life when he demanded the right to offer incense and serve as priest, but a different kind of service altogether. His confession from the underworld served as a warning to those who might be tempted to follow his path, a testimony to those who wondered whether divine authority could be safely challenged, a reminder to those who forgot the proper relationship between creature and creator. Generations of teachers would point to his example when instructing students about the dangers of pride and the importance of humility. Centuries of preachers would invoke his name when warning congregations about the seductive power of spiritual ambition. Millennia of parents would tell their children his story as an illustration of what happens when human will sets itself against divine will. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Korah's voice from the depths was not its function as warning, but its testimony to hope. For if even he, the arch-rebel, the man who had led the greatest challenge to divine authority in human history, could eventually learn to speak truth about God and Torah and himself, then perhaps no one was beyond the reach of divine grace. His sons had proven that the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon the children if the children chose a different path. Their psalms, sung in temples and synagogues for thousands of years, stood as monuments to the possibility of redemption, to the power of grace to transform even the most unpromising material into instruments of worship and praise. And Korah himself, speaking from the depths of judgment, proved that truth is stronger than pride, that reality is more persistent than self-deception, that even the most stubborn rebellion must eventually yield to the patient persistence of divine love. In the end, his voice joins the great chorus of all creation, not as a solo performer demanding attention, but as one among many who have learned to sing the only song that ultimately matters, the song of acknowledgement, the hymn of submission, the eternal melody of creatures recognizing their Creator and finding in that recognition not diminishment, but fulfillment, not defeat but victory, not death but life. The earth remembers where Korah fell, but heaven remembers where his voice finally learned to rise in praise of the one whose authority he had once challenged and whose mercy he now proclaims from the depths of divine justice. And in that memory, the story of rebellion becomes the story of redemption. The tale of pride becomes the testimony of grace, and the voice of the rebel becomes the voice of the redeemed, crying out across the centuries with words that will never be silenced. Moses is true, and his Torah is true, and we are liars, but even liars can learn to speak truth in the presence of the God who is truth itself.